promise no spoilers this time, but toward the end of the first Harry Potter, some people are having flashbacks right now. Toward the end of the first Harry Potter, Voldemort says to Harry, "There is no good and evil. There is only power, and those too weak to seek it." Power, the desire for power, and particularly the abuse of power, is something that we see all around us. We see it in politics, and maybe you saw the Superior comic of going into the elections and just calling out basically every party on the ballot for the things that they were getting wrong. None of them are perfect. We see it in the corporate world, and unfortunately we also see it in the church. Not even churches are immune to the struggles for power. I'm busy listening to a podcast series at the moment called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which is basically just tracing the story of an American pastor, Mark Driscoll, his rise, the establishment of this empire of a megachurch, and then its overnight dissolution, following a number of controversies, particularly around the leadership of Mark Driscoll and arguably his abuses of power. I don't know what Voldemort. I don't know that Voldemort was right to say that there is no good and evil, that there is only power, but there definitely is power. But what we'll see today is that the kings of Israel, most eager to hold on to it, most eager to seek it, were also the ones that were furthest away from what God wanted and from how God imagined his kingdom to look. So we're going to think first about the origins of the kingship. The story picks up where we left off at the end of Judges. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. We see the situation in the opening chapters of Samuel that things are a mess. The people are sick of the judges. The judges actually aren't doing their job. They're perverting justice and basically just doing what they want to, abusing power and using it to their own advantage. So they ask God for a king. And God doesn't like this, not because he has a problem with them having a king per se, but because of their reasons for wanting a king. We read earlier from Deuteronomy 17 that God actually has a blueprint for what he expects the king to look like. It would be a bit of a funny thing to say if he then said, no, but I don't actually want a king. But when the people come asking for a king, what they say is, 1 Samuel 8 verse 5, "Appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." And a few verses later, Yahweh told Samuel, "Listen to what the people are saying to you. It is not you they've rejected. They've rejected me as their king." Effectively, God says, fine, they can have a king. Let them see what happens. Let them see all the things that I want them about country. So the very next chapter, we're introduced to a man named Saul, who's tall and handsome, but turns out not to be particularly devoted to God or attentive to what he has to say. David, who we're introduced to a few chapters later, is the complete opposite. When Samuel is going to anoint David, God says, Yahweh does not look at the things that people look at. People look at outward appearances, but Yahweh looks at the heart. The rest of 1 Samuel is about David's long journey to taking the throne, and when he does, 2 Samuel shows that his reign is far from perfect, and we saw that a little bit in just thinking through Psalm 51, that even the giants of faith like David got things horribly wrong. But even so, God makes David a promise in 2 Samuel 7. Really important promise. A really important part of the Bible storyline that Leanne read for us. It revolves around houses. So the Hebrew word here is bayit. If you like the house, then buy it. But the word bayit actually carries a few different meanings, and I think what the author here is doing is kind of playing off of those meanings. So David realizes that he's living in a bayit of cedar. a house of cedar, or his palace, while God lives in a tent. So he resolves to do something about it. He's going to build God a bayit, a temple. But God says, no, he didn't ask for a bayit, and he doesn't need a bayit. No, instead, he is going to make David a bayit, a dynasty. He's going to establish David's household. So, 2 Samuel 7, verse 11, the Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up for your offspring. I'll raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So the question is, which of David's descendants is this going to be? So let's think for a little bit about the rise and fall of kingship. On the whole, the books of 1 and 2 Kings are pretty dismal. Although things seem to get off to a good start with David's son Solomon, the book just seems to be story after story of bad king after bad king perverting justice, going the opposite way to what God expects and intends for the nation, and leading them into sin and idolatry. And some of the depths to which they descend are just absolutely horrendous. But it isn't all bad. Along the way, we are introduced to 3 incomparable kings. So the first is Solomon, who is incomparable in wisdom. Solomon is introduced as a new Adam figure in the language that's used to describe him. He's said to have dominion in 1 Kings 4:21, calling to mind the commission in Genesis 1:28, and is knowledgeable about all sorts of aspects of creation, recognizing that he has a kingdom to run that's too numerous to count or number. He asks for God's help, but that too numerous to count or number calls to mind the promise made to Abraham, which we also saw was connected to the commission back in Genesis 1:28. So, realizing this, he asks God for a lev shomea, a listening heart, which same word for the Shema, which we saw in Deuteronomy 6. The call to love God and to give him our allegiance with our all. So God says, I'll do what you ask. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. A wise and discerning heart that he intends Solomon to use in the pursuit of covenant faithfulness. A wise and discerning heart that he intends Solomon to use to obey his commands. And along the way, things look like they're going really well. Solomon is wealthy. He accumulates horses and chariots imported from Egypt, so we know it's the best of the best. Silver and gold are as common as stones in Israel. And when the Queen of Sheba comes to visit, she says that he's actually twice as impressive as she thought he was. On all counts, it seems that Solomon's reign is impeccable. Well, maybe not on all counts. The kingdom was incredible by human standards. The question is, how did it shape up according to God's standards? Deuteronomy 17, which we read a little while ago, gives us a picture of what God expected the kingship to look like. When you enter the land the Lord your God has given you, and have taken possession of it, and settled in it, and you say, let us have a king over us like all the other nations around us, be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to go get more. For the Lord has told you, you're not to go back that way again. You must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. And he must not accumulate large amounts of silver or gold. Usually the story is told that Solomon was this great, wise, obedient king who married too many women, who led him into idolatry, and the wise king died a fool. But when we hold Solomon up to the light of Deuteronomy, we see that it didn't start with his foreign wives. Solomon's fall wasn't in spite of his wisdom. It was by means of it. Solomon used his wisdom to fashion a very impressive kingdom by human standards. But a kingdom that was completely antithetical to what God intended and the blueprint that God set. By the end of Solomon's reign, God is hot with anger because the one thing the king was supposed to do in Deuteronomy was to be obedient to his commands and to be attentive to Torah, which clearly Solomon wasn't. So in chapter 11, God promises to split the kingdom in two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And shortly after Solomon dies, that's exactly what happens. Solomon is the first incomparable king, incomparable in wisdom. The second is Hezekiah, incomparable in faith. Hezekiah trusted in Yahweh, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He's contrasted with his father Ahaz. So let's talk about him first. Assyria, up in the north, they'd been gaining power for some time. And as time went on, and they just gained more and more control over the region. But in a lull in their rule, the northern kingdom now, Israel, wanted to capitalize. They wanted to take advantage and kind of shake the chains off that, or get rid of the pressure that Assyria was putting on them. So they teamed up with a few other nations around them, with I think it was Syria and one or two others, and they were putting pressure on Judah to join the coalition. Together we can resist Assyria. Maybe if we had your help, then we could actually do something worthwhile here. But Ahaz wasn't having it. Ahaz wasn't interested in joining this. He didn't think it was a good idea. But they kept putting pressure. So around that time, Isaiah was on the scene, the prophet. And he went to Ahaz and met him at the washer's field and said, "Don't stress your face. It's going to be fine. All of this is going to come to nothing. If you don't stand firm in faith, you won't stand firm at all." Now, Ahaz has options. He could join the coalition in resisting Assyria, but he wasn't really keen to do that. He could take Isaiah's advice and trust God. But as it turns out, that way was a bit too scary for him. Or he could call on Assyria for help, which is actually the way that he goes. Ahaz sent messages to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. "I am your servant and vassal. Come up and save me out of the hand of Aram and the king of Israel who are attacking me." And Ahaz took the silver and gold found in the temple of Yahweh and the treasuries of the royal palace and sent them as a gift to the king of Assyria. The king of Syria complied by attacking Damascus and capturing it. He deported its inhabitants to Kir and put Rezin to death. Israel was conquered, which we hear about in 2 Kings 17, and we don't hear from them again. Sort of. We might come back to them later on in the series, but Israel did not fall. A generation later, Ahaz's son, Hezekiah, arrives on the scene, and he is faced with the same challenge. Again, there's a bit of a lull in Assyria's reign, and he takes advantage and stops paying his taxes. So Assyria, they don't like this, and although Hezekiah then later tries to appease their anger by giving them a nice fat tribute of gold, again from the temple, they aren't interested. By this stage, the damage is done, and they are coming. And so Isaiah rocks up, and he meets Hezekiah at the washer's field. And again, he presents him with the same question. Will Hezekiah trust God? In the end, that is what Hezekiah does. But shortly after that, the Babylonian envoys come around, and they're taking a look at the place. And Hezekiah, like an idiot, just shows them around and says, "Hey, look at everything. Take notes if you want." And in Isaiah 39, he comes to Hezekiah and says, "You know they're just going to come right back and take it, don't you?" The third and final incomparable king is Josiah. By the time we meet Josiah, the kingdom is in such a mess because of how bad the rest of the kings of Judah were, leading God's people into idolatry, that things have just gotten so bad that they don't even know what God expects anymore. They don't even know what it's supposed to look like to be God's people. But in 2 Kings 22, Hilkiah, Josiah's secretary, discovers the book of the law, Deuteronomy. He discovers Deuteronomy in the temple. And then kind of take it out and dust it off. And Josiah starts to read it and realizes just how far gone they are. Just how far they've moved away from what God expects. And he tears his clothes and he sets in motion a whole series of reforms. He brings a whole nation to repent before God, and they celebrate the Passover. It's an incredible moment, and Josiah is commended for his obedience. Neither before nor after Josiah was there a king like him who turned to Yahweh as he did, with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his strength, in accordance with the law of Moses. It's according to my Mishnah. All his heart, with all his soul, with all his strength. But by that stage, the damage was done. 2 Kings 23. Nevertheless, Yahweh did not turn away from the heat of his fierce anger, which burned against Judah because of all that Manasseh, who had done a whole lot of evil. He'd done horrendous things as Judah's king, including sacrifice his children. Because of all that Manasseh had done to arouse his anger. So Yahweh said, "I will remove Judah from my presence, as I removed Israel, and I will reject Jerusalem, the city I chose, and this temple about which I said my name will be there." God had had enough. He promised right back in Deuteronomy that if they didn't listen to him, if they persisted in their rebellion, he would be patient. They would reach a time where his patience would run out. They would reach a point where he would cast them out of his presence. One scholar sums it up this way: ultimately, the responsibility for Israel's exile in 586 BCE rested on the shoulders of kings who abused the people and led the nation into apostasy. So the last thing we have to look at this morning is the end of the kingship. In 2 Kings 17, the nation of Israel was taken off into exile by the Assyrians. The Assyrians were later defeated by the Babylonians, so they would become the big superpower of the day. They were the ones with the biggest armies, the biggest guns. And after the sin of king after king, in 2 Kings 25, Judah gets taken off by the Babylonians into exile. God handed them over. As we close, I think there are a few things that we can take from all this. The first is that these stories show us where God's priorities lie. In 1 Samuel 16, God says to Samuel, Yahweh does not look at the things that people look at outward appearance. God looks at the heart. Solomon asked for a listening heart. God gave him a wise and discerning heart. But by the end of the narrative, it's to his many wives that Solomon gives his heart. And the gods that he was led to worship by them. The characters in Samuel were strong and good looking. Solomon was wise and used his wisdom to fashion a kingdom that on all accounts looked very impressive. But none of that matters to God. What matters is what's going on in our heart. matters is that we give our love and our loyalty and our allegiance to God with our whole heart. That's the first thing I think we can learn from this. The second is that it's something that we've seen before, but it's highlighted for us again in Hezekiah's story, that God is absolutely trustworthy. All around him, offers were being made. Make an alliance with this nation. Call on Egypt. They've got horses. And to all that, Isaiah says, this is what the sovereign Lord, the Holy One of Israel, says. In repentance and trust is your salvation. In repentance and rest is your salvation. In quietness and trust is your strength. Or the way Psalm 46 puts it, be still and know that I am God. Thirdly and lastly, we need to realize that God's judgment is a reality. God is patient. In 2 books of Samuel and in 2 books of Kings, it took 2 books of Samuel and 2 books of Kings for God to reach the point where he had enough, where his patience ran out. But eventually that point will come. Eventually there reaches a point where their rebellion gets so bad that he's ready to cast them out of his presence. That he won't put up with them any longer. And he's going to do the same with this entire world. There will reach a point where God will demand a reckoning, where God will call to account the way that this world has turned their backs on him, the way that we've hurt him, the way that we've hurt each other, the way that we've messed up the world that we live in. Sooner or later there will come a time where God will call everything to account and he will hold people liable for the damage that they have done. But in the midst of exile and judgment, 2 Kings 25 actually gives us a glimmer of hope. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the year of Abel-Merodach, that he became king of Babylon, he released Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison. He did this on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put aside his prison clothes and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day the king gave Jehoiachin regular allowance as long as he lived. God promised David a bite. God promised David a dynasty. That a king from his line would have his kingdom established, that he would sit on the throne. And what we see here is that although the nation is in shambles, although things are a mess, although they're not even in their land anymore, God has not forgotten his promise. God will raise up a king. And with that king, God will bring about restoration and renewal. Let's pray.